Welcome, and thank you for joining us here today at this AIPH Green City Briefing, Planting for Managing Urban Heat. I'm Francesca Boyd, and I'm part of the Green City Initiative team here at AIPH. Green City projects come in all shapes and sizes, but they have one thing in common: the incredible power of plants to transform spaces and lives. Throughout this 2024-25 series, we will hear from experts and those putting into practice the incredible difference that plants can make to our urban environments. Before we delve into the topic, please could I take the opportunity to remind you of how today's webinar is going to run. First, I will introduce the MC, and this will be followed by our first speaker. After which we will have our second speaker, followed by a move to the discussion section. This is the point and your opportunity to ask questions and contribute to the discussion. So as the presentations progress, please do add your questions through the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the Worshipful Company of Gardeners for their continued support of the AIPH Green City Briefings programme. Do take the time to find out more about this unique organisation, including by viewing our earlier briefing series, which featured the work of the company based in London. And finally, it's easy to stay up to date with the latest news, projects, research and initiatives from around the world when it's delivered straight into your inbox. So why not sign up for the AIPH Green City Global Update? The next issue is due in a couple of weeks, so do that now. Now, without further delay, please may I introduce our MC for today's webinar. Sebastien Turbot joins us today with a wealth of experience, having worked across the world in directing and curating initiatives in both Qatar and at the New Cities Foundation. He currently guides governments, cities and businesses in creating content and community-driven platforms that turn ideas into actions. Alongside his role as advisor, Sebastien works as Director of Content at Earthna, where he develops the centre's overarching editorial approach and defines advocacy campaigns. His work is specifically focused on building collaborative learning and living ecosystems that help communities develop knowledge, skills, and the talents they need in order to inject sustainability into current and future societies. He was part of the founding team of TEDx Paris, so a man with great experience in sharing and inspiring. Thank you so much for being our MC today, Sebastien. Over to you.
Thank you, Francesca. Last year was the hottest year on record. And with this year paused to surpass that threshold, extreme heat, and especially extreme heat in cities, is top of mind across the world and was high on the global agenda this past summer. Many cities, as I'm sure you've seen, the world over have beaten recent records in average daily temperatures. Unfortunately, many people have also suffered, and some, too many, have died, from poll workers in India to pilgrims in Saudi Arabia. This makes today's conversation on how to cool cities, mitigate the heat island effect, and ensure that our cities remain livable through greening a very timely conversation. It's also a question that is at the heart of our focus and work at Earthna, where I work, as we support our home city of Doha in Qatar in mitigating rising temperatures and mitigating the heat island effect through greening initiatives, green corridors, and green roofs, for example. To discuss this with me today, I'm delighted and honored to be joined by two distinguished researchers, thought leaders, and practitioners. But before we hear from them, as Francesca said, don't hesitate to share your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and we'll try to take as many questions as we can during our Q&A session right after we hear from our speakers. So to get us started, let's first hear from Professor Debbie Bartlett. Debbie, you are a Chartered Landscape Architect, Fellow of the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management, and Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Your current role is as Professor of Environmental Conservation at the University of Greenwich, and you have over 35 years experience combining local government, consultancy, teaching, and research. You're particularly interested in landscape scale management, including the social and economic factors affecting resilience to environmental and climate change. Debbie, delighted to have you with us. Can you tell us more about your vision and your work?
I'll just share my screen and talk to you about project I've been working on recently. So I'm going to begin by showing you a quick video about the Cool Towns project to give you some background, and then I'll talk to you about the outputs that we've created from it.
In our changing climate, summers are getting hotter. Heat waves will also occur more often and will be more severe in the coming years. In many European cities and urban areas, hot weather causes heat stress, with major consequences for public health and the quality of life. Changes are needed in public space to reduce heat stress. Spatial adaptation is a key way to make towns climate-proof, while also improving the quality of life and increasing attractiveness. Planting trees, hanging shade sails, creating green facades and adding water elements can be effective measures against heat stress. This doesn't just keep places cooler, but can also provide added benefits. For example, more green spaces can support biodiversity, improve flood resilience and combat drought. Cities do not yet have sufficient insight into the heat problem itself and the effectiveness of the various measures. Policymakers, spatial designers and other experts can benefit from additional knowledge and practical tools to properly tackle heat stress. In the Cool Towns project, 13 European partners are working together on a suite of tools and pilots to support the decision-making process for taking spatial heat stress interventions. Solutions that make towns climate-proof in a changing climate are explored, developed and implemented. Cool Towns is supported by the European Interreg programme, 2Cs 2014-2020.
So that gives you some background to the project, and our aim was to provide cities and municipalities with the knowledge and tools to become heat resilient. The project finished in December 2022, and it was aimed at elected representatives, decision makers, but also technical specifiers and local people who, of course, have to be consulted about changes in their cities. I'm going to talk to you about the outputs from the project, but first, I'd like to say that although I'm sure we're all familiar with the urban heat island effect, what we're actually talking about in this project is small local interventions which combine to reduce UHI, but are not actually in themselves going to have an effect. Thinking about the impacts of increasing heat, they're multiple. We have economic impacts on productivity, quite significant, damage to infrastructure, social impact, Sebastien mentioned death, but also the hidden effect on morbidity and on outdoor workers in particular, learning ability, and the association with violent crime, with riots, murders and domestic violence, all increasing during hot weather. And the environmental impact on food production and also on wildlife, the wider environmental benefit consequences. Now we get headlines like this, which give the temperatures in various cities around the world during heat waves. And we need to be aware that this is talking about air temperature. And when we listen to the news and it says, you know, the weather is going to be hot, it's air temperature that's being talked about. When we're thinking about thermal comfort and the way people react to temperature, it's physiological equivalent temperature that is most significant. And this takes into account all of these different factors here on the left-hand side. And for us in Northern Europe, a PET of 18 to 23 degrees is the band in which we do not suffer thermal stress. Obviously, this is different in different parts of the world where the baseline habituated temperature is different. So we're talking about thermal comfort and looking at the vulnerable areas in cities where people might not be comfortable. So open areas in shopping centres, school playgrounds, mobility hubs and pedestrian and cycling routes are key areas where people are most likely to suffer from heat stress. So mapping those areas and combining them with where vulnerable health groups are gives us a good way to set priorities for action within cities. And this gives us our first output, which is actually showing you how this can be done. So the Urban Heat Atlas was produced by the project, and it's a standardized assessment which takes you through the steps in which you can decide in your city where you need to take action most urgently. Now, I'm going to give links to these free downloads of the documents at the end of this presentation. Of course, there are different reasons and different things to take into account, and it's very unlikely that one intervention will be put in just simply to reduce heat stress. The seasonal aspects apart from anything else. And we did a survey looking at what decision makers were most interested in, and maintenance costs came out as top, not capital cost. But we need to think about which intervention is most effective at increasing thermal comfort. Even sheep know that shade is the best way to deal with heat stress. And of course, planting trees is a key way to provide shade. It's just not always possible. And here you see a street in which trees could not be planted, but shade sails can give that shade effect. It's really helpful. And surface treatments are also important. Even when you're planting trees, whether they're planted in paving or in vegetation, has a real effect on how effective they are. So here you can see that vegetated paving, even in the shade, is much cooler than non-vegetated. Particularly in America, there's work going on about pavements, putting in reflective ground surfaces to reduce heat stress. But this needs treating with caution because, of course, if you do this to a pavement, people walking on the pavement will be subject to increased heat stress from the reflection. And there is actually research which shows how it increases the temperature inside buildings, and so the cooling requirement. So not as effective as trees. But we looked at a range of interventions from different types of trees, different species of trees, shelter canopies, green walls, water features and cool surfaces. We didn't look at green roofs because they contribute to UHI, but not so much to thermal comfort of users of areas. And we measured the effectiveness, and the method that we use for doing this is set out in this protocol or manual for doing it. Again, I'll put the link at the end. So the way we did this is using weather stations which measure all of the parameters involved in determining PET, and we determined how far the cooling effect of the different interventions travelled. So whether you were actually standing right next to this green wall or how far away from it cooling could be felt. The results of this are combined into a catalogue, the intervention catalogue, which provides all of this information. And here you see one of the pages for a pergola structure near Middleburg Station. The second page here gives further information. And in the manual, we have a whole set of different double pages like this on different types of interventions. Here is one of the 2 pages for a green bench in Southend in England, and you can see clearly how the greenery planting on the bench reduces PET. Under the seat of the bench is a water reservoir, which reduces the maintenance costs on this. So this catalogue has got a lot of examples, and I hope that this will be useful to some of you in your planning. We need to remember that trees particularly provide many benefits, but they need to establish and grow, and they take a long time to mature. So this needs to be taken into account. And one of the partners in the project was Green Blue Urban, who produce root root cell structures which provide the perfect growing medium for trees to establish and have the additional benefit of preventing surface water flooding. So it's combining these things together increases the likelihood of successful solutions to heat stress. Final output from the project was this roadmap, which kind of summarizes the project of looking at what is heat stress, what places have heat stress potential, and how can this be reduced, and what is the best option in your particular situation. There are case studies and examples. The 3 documents that I've spoken about, the heat atlas for prioritizing areas for action, the measurement protocol, how to determine the effectiveness of different interventions, and the catalogue, which provides the actual information. Here are the links to the free downloads. Thank you very much for listening, and if you require any further information, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you very much. Lots of interesting things there. I think we all look forward to hearing more from you at the end of our session. But now to our second speaker, Professor David Simon. David, you're a Professor of Development Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London, and you were Director of Mistra Urban Futures from 2014 to 2019. Your research encompasses principally the interface between development and the environment in the context of sustainability and global environmental and climate change, with a particular reference to urban, peri-urban, and regional change. You're also the author of Sustainable Human Settlements within the Global Urban Agenda that was launched to coincide with the start of COP28 last year in Dubai. Finally, I'm happy to say that we are also collaborating together with Earthna on comparison of sustainability challenges in specifically hot and arid countries, and we hope to be presenting this at our Earthna Summit. I'll do a little bit of advertising for Earthna at our global summit to be held next April in Doha, and please join us. But in the meantime, David, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, and it's delightful to be here again and to renew various acquaintances with AIPH and yourself that we forged earlier this year, in fact, in Doha at the AIPH conference. I'm going to pick up several of the themes that Debbie just covered and expand them with examples from different parts of the world, but also help to situate them in a broader context, but highlighting the importance of trees and other forms of vegetation in tackling the urban heat island effect. I think it's always helpful to remind ourselves that what we take for granted as the sort of modern, industrialized, in inverted commas, Western style of urbanization and urbanism, which is resource intensive, lots of concrete, tarmac, steel, glass, and other such materials, is actually very recent. But we have a very long urban history on this planet, going back at least 5,000 or 6,000 years, and that barrier keeps being pushed back. But what characterized pre-industrial societies all around the world, and that is important, not just in this part of the world, but globally, is that they were generally highly connected to their surrounding nature and environment. In fact, most indigenous traditions, cosmologies, whatever you want to call them, fundamentally situated people not as we think of ourselves as somehow separate and separated from nature and perhaps even masters of nature, but fundamentally as part of nature. And therefore the sort of duality that we're used to in contemporary society was completely alien to them. And one of the key parts of that cosmology was the idea of people as trustees, as guardians of nature, rather than as exploiters of nature. And that sort of ethos, no matter how big or how small the settlements were, and remember, we're also here talking about centers of great empires, the Incas of Peru, the Mayas in the Yucatan of Mexico and adjacent Guatemala, for example, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Mughals, the various Chinese empires, and so on, which long predated many such civilizations in Europe, although we have the Etruscans, we have the Cretans, the Greeks, Romans, and so on. But all of those were fundamentally connected to the natural environment and the resource base. And therefore, the sort of sustainability challenges we now confront were somewhat alien. And many of those societies collapsed when, either as a result of conquest or a volcanic eruption, earthquake, whatever, the basis of that sustainability was ruptured. So today, our key challenge in terms of thinking about nature in the city and nature of the city is about trying to reconnect and working out, understanding fundamentally that we cannot do it without nature, that renaturing the city, as it is sometimes called, wherever we are, whatever the cities look like, is fundamental to addressing the sorts of challenges that Debbie was outlining, to mediate the impacts of climate change and ensuring longer-term sustainability and resilience. And crucially, cities are not islands. They are part of those wider territories, countries, provinces, regions, counties, whatever. And we see that in terms of sustainable water and food supplies, the importance of resource flows, timber, waste disposal, and so on. And that reconnection spatially, as well as psychologically and in terms of our understanding of our position in nature, is fundamental. And what we do today, increasingly, is experiment around the world with environmentally adapted architecture. We look at different agrohydrological systems, and increasingly also trying to adapt elements of those indigenous architectural traditions to the modern world with modern materials to help us with passive cooling, for example, passive hydraulic pressure to move water into places where it wouldn't otherwise occur, to stabilize sand dunes and so on. And in the context of greening cities, also to help with shade, with making people feel better in sense of well-being, and also in terms of tackling poverty, for example, ensuring that where possible we use fruit-bearing trees and so on that can help address food deficits, as well as just being aesthetically beautiful and providing shade. Many of these cities, as I said, were profoundly sustainable. Examples here from different parts of the world, but if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see a shaded courtyard with a fountain in the middle, which is typical of many parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and elsewhere, because it was well understood that courtyards with an atrium, with shade, and with water features, fountains, other arrangements were crucial instruments for cooling and helping address the PET that Debbie was talking about. This is a graph that was produced by colleagues of mine working in a project in Ghana, and this is from Tamale, which is on the Saharan Savannah interface, with temperatures logged in different ways over that period. And if you look at the light green bar on the histogram, tree cover, you'll see that the temperature under the tree was about 35.5, just below 36 degrees Celsius, whereas all the other building materials, the exteriors, were higher. Some of the temperatures inside, of course, were lower, but the key point I want to convey by that graph is that the cooling effect of tree shade is, in that kind of context, about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. And again, obviously, these figures vary according to whether you're in tropical, subtropical, humid, semi-arid, arid zones, temperate zones, and so on. But the principle is really important. The next point I want to convey is the importance of a systems approach, not just fixating on the trees, the bushes, the shrubs, the grasses, but seeing that as part of an integrated blue-green infrastructure approach to promote resilience, live in greater harmony with the environment wherever we are, and as I mentioned, also by doing that, reducing poverty. So if you just look at the elements that I've highlighted in yellow, these reflect the kinds of systems that link together. And again, Debbie had some nice examples in her diagrams, but what we're talking about really is right at the bottom, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, which is a way of valuing nature by putting monetary value on it and ensuring it doesn't get neglected, building tree cover, vegetative areas, networks of walkways, shaded areas, leisure parks alongside and interacting with lakes, rivers, waterways of whatever sort, and then green roofs, urban and peri-urban agriculture. And there's this growing area now about regeneration and restorative agriculture and greening more generally. So these are the components of a systems approach. And here are a few examples from different contexts. This one is indeed where Sebastien works, the work of the Earthna Center with various test beds in Doha, experimenting with green roofs using locally adapted drought-resistant species, different grasses, and also within the city, the idea of tree islands, breaking up the monotony, as it were, of the brick, the concrete, the paved areas, and making them much more livable. Some years ago, Nanjing in China, once a very heavily polluted industrialized city, was transformed within a few years in the way that only China could achieve with its particular political system, into one of the greenest in China, making it much more livable, cleaning up, detoxifying the soil, but crucially, as you see there, making sure that all sorts of areas, whether it's the old city walls, and bear in mind that Nanjing is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the planet, or new high-rise housing areas, leisure areas along the rivers, are integrated in the way that I was just describing as a sort of network, an urban network of green spaces, not just clumps of trees or little islands of green. And even in one of the most densely populated parts of the high-income world, Manhattan in New York, a series of incremental measures have actually come together to make a dramatic improvement to the lived environment, even over the time that I've been going there regularly. And top left, you see painting roofs in the silver or white to reflect, and that avoids the problem that Debbie alluded to with road surfaces. Then in the center, you have a derelict railway line that has been repurposed. Many of you have probably heard of or perhaps even visited the High Line, which is a wonderful resource, heavily utilized, revegetating leisure space elevated above ground, and indeed is now being emulated in Camden in London, where a similar elevated derelict railway line is in the process of being repurposed. Top right, you see people's patios, roofs, and so on being greened, all playing a part. And the two bottom photographs are one of the most amazing regeneration projects that I've seen anywhere, which is on the Hudson River, the lower west side of Manhattan, which has been turned into an intensively used leisure area, lots of green spaces, multiple species, rich biodiversity, and together with the improved water quality in the Hudson, indeed the East River as well, fish species are occurring again that haven't been there for many decades. And that is part of the point. These are not just individual interventions, they're part of wider systemic approaches. And I've just been, for the work that I'm doing with Sebastien and Earthna, both in Jaipur in Rajasthan, semi-arid part of northwest India, and also last week in Lima in Peru, a desert city on the Pacific coast. And even there, again, elements of indigenous tradition being modified through the colonial and the post-colonial periods to do all the same things. And again, top left, you see a water feature, a fountain, a courtyard, multiple species, different elevations, different biodiversity properties, coming together to ensure that, if you like, to use a cliche, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And Lima is really interesting because in many of the middle class and higher income areas, you'll see sorts of views I've produced there, very much into greening of the city and all the rest of it. But as one of the architects I interviewed last week who works for an environmental NGO said, well, actually, given that we have between 15 and 18 millimeters of rain per annum, and most of the moisture along the coast comes from condensation from the nightly fog that covers it for much of the year, talking about green cities is rather odd and very much a sort of Euro-American imposition, legacy of colonialism and all the rest of it. And really what we should be talking about is not that kind of Western lawn manicured shrubberies that need intensive watering, which is bizarrely done with drinking quality water rather than treated or recycled wastewater, as increasingly popular elsewhere. And therefore it competes with human and animal use and agricultural use. But we should be talking about natural areas or ecological areas. And the photograph top right illustrates that, where again, you've got greenery with appropriate local or other drought-resistant species that require much less water, much less maintenance, and are, in that sense, much more effective. But it just reminds us that we need to think a little bit more carefully when we talk about greening as if it's a universal good, which it sort of is, but that in different cultural, different environmental contexts, we maybe need to rethink the envelope a little bit. So finally, to try and pull that together, and think about what we plant, where we plant, how we plant, in the context of its benefits, the intensity of care, of nutrition, of water that is required, and the system that might be provided locally to do that in a sustainable way. I've just pulled together 4 key points about being imaginative with our planting, use indigenous or locally appropriate, generally multi-species rather than monospecies planting, and that the more of that we can do and the more integrated it is with other elements of the urban fabric, the more effective it's going to be. We've touched on the ecosystem services, the idea of valuing nature. Again, it's not without its problems. Some people call it marketized environmentalism, but it's part of a broader approach that can achieve the kinds of benefits we've both been talking about. And there's a long history here, even within town planning, landscape architecture, that has evolved since the early days of Patrick Geddes and the Garden Cities movement, for example. And now we talk increasingly about blue-green, or in the context of what I've just said, perhaps even blue-green-brown infrastructure appropriate to local circumstances. And if we can achieve all that, and hence horticulturalists play an important role, as do landscape architects and working with the other appropriate professions, we can achieve the mitigation as well as the adaptation and the transformation or transitions of urban areas to more sustainable futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. First of all, I mean, to remind our audience that we highly encourage you to share your questions for 2 panelists in the Q&A box. I'll be taking your questions to our panelists. As I was preparing this, being the kind of candid, non-specifically greening expert, I was wondering, you hear in the news, and this is a question both for you, David and Debbie. You hear in the news about, all these announcements being made across the world of, X millions of trees will be planted by 2030, 2040, 2050. And I guess, David, you touched on it on your Lima example, but I'd be curious to hear Debbie on, what's good greening versus bad greening, if that makes sense. So we heard David. We'll hear from on Lima an example of that. Debbie, what would your answer be to this question?
Well, I touched very briefly on it by saying trees have lots of benefits, not just for heat, But the important thing is that they need to grow and establish properly. And just planting a tree doesn't do anything. You have to look after it. And again, I said, you know, the key issue for decision makers, I mean, I had to rush through a lot of material very quickly, but we did a wide-scale survey of decision makers to say, you know, what are you thinking about when you're thinking of this type of intervention? It's maintenance costs that are more important than the capital. And here we have lots of grants for tree planting, but I'm not aware of any grants for ongoing maintenance. And particularly in the urban environment, it's a very tough environment to plant trees in. And if you look at the trees in London, very few of them are native. Very few of our street trees in London, and yet you will always hear people. It's a different topic. I could bang on about it for a long time. You know, what is a native species? And in our changing environmental conditions, which is not just climate, but other things as well, are we sensible to be thinking of what we now consider native? There are arguments for thinking very carefully about what species we're planting, because we want trees to live for a long time.
So you would argue that, for example, a particular example of London, the trees that London have are not necessarily the most adapted, suited, let's say, for the environment in London.
No.
And okay.
No, what I'm saying is that when people are thinking about planting trees, they tend to say, oh, we need to plant native trees because of, well, biodiversity. But I always say, well, look at the street trees in London. How many of the street trees in London are native species?
Okay.
And they're not, because the conditions are tough, and, you know, oak trees grow in woodlands. That's what they're adapted to. You do not see oak trees planted as street trees in London successfully. What do you think, David?
I was going to say, I would go even further in the sense that conditions are not static. In the context of climate change, rainfall, heat, all the other parameters which are critical to the health of trees longer term are changing. And the southeast of England is predicted by the middle of the century, which after all is only 25 years away now, to have a Mediterranean type climate. Yeah. And we see lots of evidence around that. I observe it in our garden on the outskirts of Greater London. We've been starting to plant more drought resistant species over the last few years. Lawns, for example, are increasingly challenged. They're also, of course, biodiversity in biodiversity terms, pretty impoverished. And so thinking about different species of grass, I know people who've ripped up their lawns and either used other materials or even astroturf and so on. But, you know, we have to factor in changing environmental contexts. It's not a stable environment anymore, and that is part of the challenge.
I think it's important. That word environmental is important. And I try not to talk about climate change, but talk about environmental change, because it's not just the climate factors. It's also pollution. It's also nitrogen deposition, which is affecting plants pretty dramatically. And yes, there is an argument for sourcing our plant material from Barcelona, that kind of area. Of course, that also has knock-on effects, and we need to be thinking in terms of pests and disease as well.
Absolutely.
Not just temperature conditions. So I think we live in very challenging, but also very stimulating times in terms of our planting. But of course, it's a very difficult area to research, because do we have time, David? To do research on trees, we need,
plant today for the future generations. Yes,
exactly. I mean, a lot of my work has been in forestry, and in forestry, you think in much longer term than perhaps in terms of gardening.
Yeah,
but, yes, I mean, I'm interested in other, trees are a very obvious solution, but the way in which we treat trees in England is very, very different to, for example, how trees are treated in France, the Netherlands. I've got a lovely picture of plane trees in Holland, trained absolutely flat on a cartwheel to maximize their shade potential. And you show that to people in England and they say, oh no, that's completely unacceptable, both on aesthetically, but also in time, in the time taken to prune. We don't have the time to prune. But yes, back to you, Sebastien.
Thanks for that. So we're starting to get questions. Linking to what you were saying earlier, David, someone's asking, what are some of the most heat and drought tolerant plants suitable for urban gardening?
Heat tolerant.
Yes, heat and drought tolerant plants. I would suppose a hot, somewhere that's pretty hot, that's facing heat issues and drought issues.
Yeah.
Let's say Middle East or Mediterranean.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the less well-known things is that some of the more drought-tolerant plants that many of us are familiar with around the world, like the multiple species of geraniums, various species of aloe, are actually indigenous to South or different parts of Southern Africa. There are, yucca palms and other things which again have been brought around, as have casuarina trees in terms of saline tolerance and dune stabilization and so on in otherwise inhospitable locations. And they are increasingly evident and being used in the sorts of contexts we're talking about. But again, we've learned through several centuries of imperial plant relocations, shall we say, that even species which do their thing extremely well in their indigenous context may have many harmful side effects in other contexts. Casuarinas are one, the Australian eucalyptus, the various species in blue gums are another classic example. European pines, or one of these species, Pinus pinaster, which was taken to South Africa. The eucalyptus are all around the world to provide the sorts of functions we've talked about, but they actually cause mayhem if they're grown and they go feral, if you like, uncontrolled, because they drain the groundwater, they acidify the soil, which makes it much more difficult for other species to grow underneath and so on. So again, the point of local appropriateness rather than just, as it were, generically drought tolerant or hardy is really, really important.
I've done a lot of work on Prosopis in India, which is a plant that has been introduced from its native range for particular characteristics. It's very drought and heat tolerant, but has all sorts of disadvantages. And on our work on that, just very briefly summarized, one part is saying this is an invasive plant, it needs to be got rid of. And yet local people were finding it incredibly useful. So it's quite tricky, and it brings us back to a very interesting thing that needs to be discussed is, what do we mean by native plants? And what we generally mean by native plants are, well, those best adapted to the ambient conditions. And what we have a situation now where our native plants are no longer the best adapted. But yes, absolute minefield. We could have a fantastic discussion on this topic, but possibly
Indeed.
not now.
Maybe we could lead into the other question I can see on the Q&A, which is about how we factor mangroves into this in arid climates. And I think, that I can answer quite briefly, in the sense that they are very widespread in all sorts of different environments, and in many arid and semi-arid areas, they are absolutely critical, both in terms of their hardiness, their salt tolerance, their ability to regenerate if given half a chance. And in many semi-arid and arid areas, I know they are one of the main forms of greenery along coastal zones, and of course stabilize dunes, prevent erosion, provide breeding grounds through the roots for many aquatic species, and therefore are fundamental to the health of estuaries, lagoon systems, as well as the coast, and many fish and other invertebrate and amphibian species rely on them for breeding. So yeah, they are a sort of benchmark species, and you can often judge the health of an ecosystem by the health of the mangroves.
Debbie, do you want to comment on this, on the mangroves?
I mean, mangroves are not something that I have worked on mangroves in the Caribbean, but they're not something I've had much to do with in the urban context. Okay. There is can I just add, there's another question there about talking about cities like Cairo. Can I just give a plug for a Sustainable Cities Conference being run by former PhD students of mine at MSA in Cairo? If you message me, I can send you information about that conference. I'm one of the keynote speakers, and it's going to be in early December.
Okay. And talk about Cairo, there's a World Urban Forum organized by UN Habitat in November as well. And David and I will be there. So if anyone here will be in Cairo for WOOF, please come and join us. But that being said, on the Cairo question, the gentleman saying that it's going in the opposite direction. You've both hinted on some of the barriers. Typically, Debbie, you talked about the maintenance cost. But if I come back, if I ask both of you to list like the three main, because I think is anyone against greening? I guess not. So what are the three kind of main barriers to kind of more? Maybe you'll tell me that some people are against greening.
Yes, there are. Yeah.
Okay, well, tell us about that as well. But then, what are the three kind of main kind of policy, let's say, barriers to more kind of massive greening projects in cities around the world?
Well, the one that we come across most is health and safety. If you plant trees, even evergreen trees, you will have leaf fall, and that is a hazard. Slips, trips, falls, wet leaves, as well as a maintenance issue. Trees encourage birds to roost in them. And people get very upset about pigeons.
That's true.
There are these issues, and people worry about trees growing and causing problems with electricity wires falling on houses, branches falling off. Decision makers are very risk averse. And they would really rather have a plastic one in many cases.
And
David,
or
I think you mentioned AstroTurf, and it's the same thing. So yes, it's hard to believe, but yeah, there are people who are very anti-greening and come up with all sorts of arguments.
David, on the anti-greening front, and or the main barriers to cities and policymakers in implementing more larger scale projects around greening?
I don't want to repeat what Debbie has said, with which I agree entirely. But coming back to the link with the question about Cairo going the other way from Ahmed Lotfi, yes, Cairo is going the other direction, reversing some recent progress a little while ago in terms of greening parts of Cairo. And I will, as Sebastien just said, see it in a couple of months for myself for the first time. But I think that points to one of the other key obstacles and barriers, and that is the sort of obsessive modernist ideology of urbanism in a kind of Western-centric way, which is ironic because Egypt is one of the countries with the longest urban traditions in the world. Lots of indigenous architecture, and indeed, when I was talking about hybridization, that's been happening in Egypt far longer than anywhere else I know, in terms of trying to utilize elements of indigenous Islamic architecture, urban design, watershade, the sorts of things I was talking about, and trees are central to that. So it's slightly bizarre, and that kind of idea that it's got to kind of compete the Miamis and the Tokyos and wherever else is in the world, and the Gulf states again illustrate the same sort of problem, challenge. That is part of the problem. So they are, as I was saying at the beginning, still in the business of designing nature out of the cities, when any sense of sustainability, climate resilience, or indeed any other resilience requires us to be bringing nature back in and regarding nature as part of the city, not somehow as alien or foreign to the city.
Thank you, David. On that, unfortunately, very unfortunately, because I think we could go on for hours, it's already time for us to close this amazing conversation. I encourage our viewers and listeners to connect with us on our various social media. David and I will be at Wolf. We'll be hosting our Earthna Summit as well in Doha. So this conversation is very much to be continued. I'm sure Francesca will be walking us through the AIPH Green Cities the next initiatives. So on this note, just to thank both of you, Professor David and Professor Debbie. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. And yes, only to be continued. And on this note, Francesca, back over to you.
Thank you ever so much, Sebastien. And thank you for joining us here today for AIPH's Green City Briefing. I mean, we really have heard some inspiring things there, not only about the urgency for cities and in relation to climate change, but also the opportunities that are found in including plants in our urban planning. As Sebastien says, we have a lot of things going on here in AIPH Green City Initiative, including the awards next week, which is ever so exciting, and a real opportunity to showcase some of the incredible work that is happening around the world to bring the ideas as discussed here today together and transform our environments. So now I'd like to take the time to thank our speakers, both Debbie and David, for those excellent presentations and discussion, and our MC, Sebastien. Thank you ever so much. Absolutely fascinating. To our audience, thank you for joining us here today. We do hope you've enjoyed it, and be sure to join us for the rest of the briefing series. Next month, we will be exploring inspiring green cities of the future, where we're really talking about young people and their, the next generation of what happens in our urban environments. If you have learned something today, or you have got something to share, please do connect with us through our LinkedIn page, share your thoughts, tag us so we can respond. And I'm sure Sebastien and Debbie and David are there too, if you would like to connect with them. Additionally, today's session has been recorded and it will be available on the AIPH YouTube channel shortly. So if you'd like to share that with someone else or just watch it again, please do that. Finally, I'd like to once again thank our sponsor of the briefing series, the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. Until next time, thank you ever so much for joining us. And from me and the AIPH Green City team, goodbye.